So hopefully everything's good. You guys can see my PowerPoint up. I know we only have so much time, so I'm going to just dive right on into it. So, of course, we're talking about the use of karmic systems within the Mass Effect trilogy. So as Christine was saying, focusing mainly just on Mass Effects 1 to 3, but I do want to explore very deeply how BioWare, I believe, really undercuts some of those ethical dilemmas and the ability to make these moral decisions amongst the player. So to start off, I want to address what we use as titles for these binary choices. We have Paragon and Renegade. So if we have a definition of Paragon, we typically see it as a model of excellence or perfection. And we typically see this amongst the idea of Paragon of virtue. And this is someone who we see as someone who has no moral faults. So within Mass Effect, they're typically someone who's more empathetic, they're kind, and they use their charm and charisma typically to diffuse situations. Now, if we look on the other side of that and we have the renegade, this is someone who rejects lawful or conventional behavior. There's someone who typically acts in a more sarcastic way, they're confrontational, and in Mass Effect, they use violence or threats most often to intimidate other people. So if we compare these two definitions, we have someone who opposes the perfect example of someone who has a perfect or near perfect concept of what is right and wrong. Now, I believe, however, that in using these titles, we're kind of undercutting the really nuanced ideas of how this interacts within quite literally a whole universe. So if we were to look at Paragon as absolutism, it's that idea that, we believe that certain principles or values are something that are universally valid. It doesn't matter what kind of unique variations there are. There's that clear kind of cut black and white idea of what is right, what is wrong. And this kind of then goes into absolutists seeing themselves in a more positive light, and seeing themselves as someone who's very rigid in terms of their permanence and seeing the order with certain things. So in this, it could be in the natural world, it could be social political systems, et cetera, et cetera. So if we pair the idea of absolutism then with Paragon, we then understand that it's someone who believes that right and wrong is something completely universal, which already, if we were looking on it on just Earth's aspect, that can be very difficult in itself. But now, if we're including all these different races, it gets very, very complex. A relativist can be a little bit more difficult to define, but there are a couple definitions. And one of them is the idea that it directly rejects the idea of absolutism and believes that facts or truth are very dependent on specific things. Could be language, could be cultures, and it's up to your own kind of subjective standards. They also believe that depending on the different ideas that come head to head with one another, that they're both equally valid. They both have equal footing in being their own opinion, and it's hard to try and discern which one is correct. So if we then pair that with the idea of what a renegade is, we have a character who then goes against the idea that there are universal truths and concepts of what is right and wrong, and they're far less on a idea to stick together with the proper kind of status quo of what is set in law. So it gets more difficult because once you start getting into the later Mass Effect games, instead of just being kind of like an anti-hero or renegade, they're typically seen as more kind of like a bad person compared to a person of virtue. And I think it starts to miss the point because a renegade could very well share certain morals or values of a person who's seen as a paragon. But the key difference is that they understand that this isn't something universal and that it's very much subjective to what they're doing, especially when they're trying to save billions and trillions of lives. So the first issue I have with this trilogy, which I will say I love, by the way, I have a little mass relay tattooed on my arm, but I believe that they really encourage reactive play. And a part of this comes because we need to start being able to engage deeply with the morality of these worlds. And we have to understand that what we're doing in these games are something that holds actual weight to them. So if we're looking at reactive versus reflexive players, reactive players tend to kind of they just want to achieve the goals of the game. And that's totally fine. Some games, I just want to play. I don't want to think too hard. I just want to enjoy and relax. But some games like Mass Effect, which I think is trying to, really engage with, is having reflective players who reflect and engage with their actions in an ethical manner and really reflect on the moral weight of all their actions. Now, one of the biggest uses of reactive play is through the use of interrupts. So this came in the second game of the trilogy, and essentially the developers created a system where on either bottom side of the screen, you would get a sound ping or like sound effect, and then a flashing icon of either the Renegade or the Paragon symbol. And in doing so, you would interrupt the dialogue or the action happening to then get a specific action. Renegade interrupts are the best interrupts. Shout out to the one where you can literally kick a dude off a building, like all the way down like 90 stories. Um, so in doing so, because you're getting a sound cue, you're getting a visual cue, you're getting a sense that the flashing is telling you that there is a certain amount of time that you have to hit this button, you are more likely than not, I believe, to start eliciting these same reactions every single time they pop up, especially when you are starting to look at, following one specific type of playthrough, which I'll get to in a very quick moment. I believe people are tending to do. You don't really stick in the middle within the Mass Effect games. There's not much of a need to. So if you start to get rewarded with points, basically, because every time you do a specific karmic action, you get a set number of points, and you start seeing that charisma level rising, I believe that this is starting to really impact how you are going to start making decisions while you're playing the game. So you're using these points as a reinforcer, and especially on a first playthrough, but once the game started introducing New Game Plus and people started to, get their gear brought over, their stats brought over, people want the best playthrough on the first run, so they're all set for the next ones. It gets very easy to just want to stick with either being full Paragon or full Renegade. So after the use of interrupts, this then brings us into dialogue choices. So Mass Effect uses scripted dialogue trees, which allow certain morals to materialize in the game. And by having these choices carry throughout the trilogy, BioWare used what we like to reference as an aggregation of choices. And essentially, that just means that you are allowed to make decisions that then carry over, and you have these consequences that you can see, but you're not exactly sure where you made that choice to begin with. So Christine brought up a great example, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Tali and the Quarians with Legion and the Geth and that whole ethical dilemma. The way that you are able to eventually reach the point where you can broker peace, you've had to have so many things layered throughout the second and third games that your brain, unless you have a guide, you have no idea where that happened. So one problem, though, that I start to have an issue with is how these physical placement of the choices are put on the screen in front of the player. So for those that haven't played the Mass Effect game before, this is a screenshot. I believe this is from Mass Effect 1. And basically on the left side of the screen, you will have options that you can ask more questions with. You are a bit more inquisitive. You want to learn more information. And then on the right side, these are your typical just get straight to the point of dialogue. I want to keep going. The top right represents Paragon. The bottom represents Renegade. And then the middle is, of course, just something in between, which quite frankly isn't really worth it most of the time. So I have an issue because if you are starting to play as one specific type of moral karmic following, you are going to most likely, at least in my experience, just stick with that side because you're not always going to want to flop back and forth. And I'll talk why this is really important. But by putting them in predetermined spots, you don't have to read the prompt anymore. I don't have to read, and what did you find? I just know top answer, Paragon answer. I want to be the good guy. And dialogue choices, again, I have a bit of an issue with because if you start looking at a game like Telltale's The Walking Dead, the way that they created their dialogue tree is there is no specific moral alignment to it. You just pick exactly what you read and what you think would suit your character best. So you actually do have to reflect on what you're saying, and especially if there's a time limit, there's that sense of urgency that, you don't have a choice to like just think about it for so long. Mass Effect, you could realistically just sit on a dialogue screen like the whole time and nothing will happen. So you can really think about it if you wanted to. But I do believe it's something that encourages this reactive type of play style. So this is where we start getting into the use of morality meters. So morality meters, of course, this wasn't the first time that we saw this within a BioWare game. Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, which is fantastic, by the way. It's one of my favorites since I was a kid. This was kind of the idea of when we first started seeing the use of these karmic meters. And of course, it adhered to the Star Wars mythos in terms of light side, dark side, but there was no point system really. It was very much, here's just a bar and we'll give you an arrow to show you where it is. But this was kind of seen as the predecessor because it was made by BioWare and it's the same system and the same director. But it's interesting because when we start to look then on how these morality meters start to affect players' choices, we start to see, after we see this morality meter, we start to see that kind of influence on players' choices. So if you start to just kind of use this as a guide instead of having something that you're just putting points into, you more often than not are going to have people who are actually trying to reflect on the decisions that they make. It's far better than if you are trying to just put points in it constantly. So it's far better to be using it that way. As well, though, Mass Effect tends to give you far more benefits if you're sticking to one morality. And more often than not, that comes when you are sticking to the morality of the Paragon run through. So even just on its own, one of them that you can always go with is you get advanced dialogue choices. So when we're looking at that ethical dilemma between Tali and Legion, you actually will be able to access a completely different set of dialogue choices that allows you to broker that peace between them. And you can only access that, especially in that case, if you've done the right decisions, but you also need a specific kind of charisma level, or of course in Mass Effect 3, it's your reputation level, which they did edit over time to not have the different karmic systems kind of balance each other out in the way where it's like, just because you did one good thing, it doesn't mean that you didn't do that bad thing. So you can see how they changed that over time. So one other thing that you can get as well is you get better weapons. So if you were able to get certain dialogue choices, you were able to then get discounts at a shop, which then means you were able to save money on buying more weapons and buying more gear, which then makes your playthrough even easier than it normally is, because some of the weapons become crazily broken with your power usage, and it's very easy to just start wiping through the game. I remember playing Legendary Edition, and by the time I reached Mass Effect 3, I was playing mainly as a biotic who was just supercharging every single person with like an upgraded shotgun, and I had no issues ever fighting in that game. It took me about 5 minutes for like each time. The biggest one, though, that I want to focus on is loyalty missions. So Mass Effect 2 was the first game that included these, and I believe it's also technically the only game that does. And loyalty missions basically has you go on a special mission with one of your crewmates, and in doing so, you are able to complete a specific side of the story that unearths more of their own background, as well as also giving you the chance to earn their loyalty. And if you want to get the best option in the final mission of the game, which is having everyone survive a suicide mission, you need every person's loyalty. And I believe everyone's loyalty can be gained by doing Paragon choices in the dialogue wheel, with the exception of Zaid the bounty hunter, who requires you to leave behind a group of researchers and let them die so you can continue chasing down the person he's trying to kill. But that is a very rare instance. Now, this becomes a little bit more of a problem, because then we see how this affects some ethical dilemmas. So you are able to start subverting these dilemmas through the morality system. So we've gone through that lovely example of Tali and Legion, and of course there are so many kind of things that come into play with that. But I think it becomes a little bit of a cop-out if you are able to broker peace just simply by getting a specific dialogue choice. Now, that one I will admit they've done a little bit better in having you have to complete certain other side missions before you get there in order to make it happen. But in instance like Rex in the first game, you are forced basically to kill unless you have had the proper amount of charisma put into your character to ensure that you can calm him down without having to shoot him. And if you don't, well, then he's just dead. But it's unfortunate, because I think you can develop so many more deeper instances and relationships if you aren't always given that kind of get that jail out of free card that you have in Monopoly, right? It's too easy to kind of cut out at the knees. And it's unfortunate, especially with Taliesin Legion. I personally found it way more heart-wrenching when I had to sacrifice one of the two than just being able to broker peace with them. And it is nice to kind of have that happy ending, but I think especially in that context, when you've had two, races completely at war with one another, and they've had their own reasons for doing so, it becomes harder and harder to pick. Do you go with the group that has had your friend and or a possible lover in it for like 3 games, or do you go with the group that was, unjustly subjected to slavery and persecution for achieving a certain level of intelligence and a certain level of connectedness amongst each other? So it gets really, really difficult. Now, key things that we need to craft an ethical dilemma are 3 things. We need ambiguity. We need to be able to compromise the player's ethics, and we also need a time limit. So the player can't know what's going on. They can't have a clear vision of what to do and what's the best option. And they always need to find some kind of guilt after. And it's kind of a weird thing to say that we want our players to feel guilty, but we need something where, we're almost picking just the lesser of two evils. And in doing so, we need there to be a time limit. We need to say, hey, if you pick neither of these options, something even worse is going to happen. And that's where I think they actually start to get a little bit better about doing this in terms of the priority missions. And priority missions came in Mass Effect 3. And basically, it was a way of taking the control of the timeline and how time moves throughout the game out of the player's hands, and instead makes it something that is consistently moving throughout the game while you play. So for those that haven't played Mass Effect 3, priority missions come up, and when you get them, you have a set number of missions I believe you can do before that mission is failed. And you can choose not to do it, but in doing so, you might be subjecting another group to a worse fate. So one of the first, I believe it's actually the first one you engage with, is you can go save a group of teachers and biotic students, which are these students who have these really cool, like, kind of telekinesis abilities, to kind of help in the war. Or you can decide, hey, there are other more pressing issues that I need to get to. There's a planet on fire, literally. There are people who are dying on every other planet. Do I have time to just go towards this school and help someone out? Now, it's unfortunate if you don't do that, because if you have a character survive from Mass Effect 2, they are actually a teacher there. And their fate, if you were to just leave them, they're turned into a Reaper creation, essentially, and become an assassin that's kind of supposed to just kill you. And it's really, really unfortunate because it's kind of just glossed over. But priority missions are really interesting in that way, because we are told that, hey, time's moving. It's wartime. You don't just have the ability to go in a linear direction of what missions we give you, and you have to completely change it up. I completely forgot priority missions were a thing in Mass Effect. Yeah, Andre, going through all my other times playing Mass Effect 3, since I mean, I played the Legendary Edition, but before that, it was like, what, 2011? Something like that, 2010. But you were kind of just told about it. Yeah, you meant to do everything else except them first, or else missions get. Yeah, so I like it in that way where we have agency. You are more than allowed to pick what missions you want to do, but there are things that are happening behind the scenes that are going to impact possibly what you might see in the ending. In this case, it affects your galactic readiness level, which is the level that they give you, and helps kind of determine who survives the final war against the Reapers, if Shepard himself or herself survives. And I think it's really, really cool. Now, I know time, I don't know if we're able to get a time check, because I lost track of time after my computer kept messing up. I'm going to assume maybe like 5 or so minutes. So I'm hoping to get through this. So relationships are really important, and manipulation rules are something that are put in place. It's kind of a subtle way of helping players get to an end goal without it being the explicit things you need to do to achieve so. So you can, by all means, not really explore these relationships when you're in the Mass Effect games, but it's a way of helping you reach another version of the ending that most, in my opinion. 8 minutes. Okay, great. Thank you, Amy. Appreciate it. It is a way where we're able to reach that end goal without it explicitly being those absolutely necessary check marks that you must hit. Now, we also must be able to feel the suffering of those in-game characters. And these authors here did this great job of explaining how if we kind of suspend our belief, we're able to engage with characters in a way that makes us believe that they're real. We engage in terms of love, in terms of friendship. When they're sad, we feel that pain. And it's something that I think Mass Effect does really well in terms of allowing us to explore these relationships. And there's two unique things that narrative games can do, and that's in terms of narrative agency and ludic agency. And they do that by allowing players to make choices in the narrative, but also being able to engage in the environment itself. And it's very important then that we start to balance those things, because when you do, I think you can create these wonderful experiences for players that then give us deeper connections, that gives us those opportunities that things don't always work out the way that we want them to. And in doing so, we're seeing that more and more players are able to then have this idea of recognition believe, and that we recognize these things as real emotions, even though that they're fictional characters. And you can lead your players to having the best possible outcome if they want to, by doing these side missions. So before we wrap up, this is the last one. And of course, we talked about this in Christine's thing, but Mass Effect 3 had an ending that was a little bit controversial, and I believe it was a bit overdetermined. And a reason for this was, I believe, we engage with these relationships, and it's a reason why so many people love this game, that especially coming from the second game where you are fighting through with all your teammates. It's this amazing final mission. The music's playing. You're hoping that everyone makes it out alive. And then you get to the third game. And by the end, you're just completely by yourself. You are making this decision for the entire galaxy to see, are you going to destroy the Reapers and all other kinds of sentient life? Are you going to synthesize with them? Are you going to create this weird kind of hybrid between synthetic and organic life? And there's been a lot of course, discussion on what is right and wrong. I personally believe that the destroy option is the best option if I'm, talking about myself, because I don't want to take away personal agency from making someone a completely different type of genetic being. And also, I personally always found the indoctrination theory really interesting. So I always was a little bit skeptical of taking full control of the Reapers. So if you haven't had the chance to look at the indoctrination theory, I 100% recommend it. But it's unfortunate because then we reach this point where you are down to this binary system again, and they've completely wiped out all relations and importance of weight that we've accumulated over literal years of playing, to have us be at this final choice of the game on our own. And I mean, I guess you can always say that Shepard was the one in charge. Shepard was almost given carte blanche because he's a specter in the game, and because he is seen as the only person who can possibly save all organic life at this point. But it's odd because, as Christine was saying, we have so many opportunities where our morals are questioned, where we are almost tested in a way on why we did what we did, and then it's completely taken out for the end of the game. And it's really unfortunate because I think there was a huge opportunity there to have this be something where you stand with these people who have shaped your Shepard and possibly you as a player, and then everyone's just kind of left feeling empty. And everyone's kind of scratching their head, and then everyone was getting really, really upset about it. So they created this overdetermined ending where all of that narrative agency was wiped away in favor of creating this ending that kind of just was watered down ethics to begin with. So this is the end. What can developers do? Balance that narrative and ludic agency, and as well use some manipulation rules. I think it's really, really important, especially when we're trying to create meaningful relationships with characters and care about what happens to them as players. And of course, if you're using a morality system, which I personally really enjoy, I was kind of upset that they took it out in Andromeda, you got to use it as a guide. I think it's important that we're not just seeing it as something just to throw points into. Rather, it's something that just kind of helps us realize, okay, where are we on this scale, but there's no points attributed to it. And that helps us understand that there's a level of ambiguity that helps those ethical dilemmas and moral alignments become a little bit more clouded and a little bit more interesting and nuanced. So thank you all for sitting with me through all those technical issues. So sorry about that. But yes, thank you so much.